Welcome. This is one of those true stories that sounds unreal until you realize every detail is rooted in verified history. They killed the only man Bumpy called brother, and what followed shocked an entire city. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments and subscribe if you value real stories backed by hours of digging through court records, biographies, and first-hand accounts, because a lot of work goes into separating truth from myth in stories like this. Before people knew his name as legend, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was simply a Harlem kid shaped by pressure, pride, and survival. Born in 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina, Bumpy didn't grow up dreaming of crime. He grew up watching power decide who lived comfortably and who didn't. When his older brother was accused of killing a white man and nearly lynched, the family sent Bumpy north to Harlem for safety. Moment mattered because it taught him early that the system wasn't built to protect him or people like him, and that lesson never left. In Harlem, Bumpy came of age during the neighborhood's transformation into a cultural and economic force, but also a battlefield. He was intelligent, sharp, tongued, and unusually well read for a street figure, known to quote Shakespeare and philosophy even while running numbers operations. That combination, brains and brutality, made him different. He wasn't just muscle, and he wasn't just a thinker. He understood leverage, respect, and reputation, and he treated all three like currency. Bumpy rose under the mentorship of Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the powerful numbers queen of Harlem. She trusted him not just to enforce, to negotiate, intimidate, and outthink rivals. While other enforcers relied purely on fear, Bumpy relied on inevitability. People believed that if he promised something, good or bad, it would happen. Belief is what made his name travel faster than he ever did. Unlike many crime bosses of his era, Bumpy had a complicated moral code. It didn't make him kind, but it made him predictable. Loyalty meant everything to him, especially in a world where betrayal was common and life was cheap. He took personal insults seriously, but betrayal, real betrayal, was unforgivable. To Bumpy, family wasn't defined by blood alone, it was defined by who stood beside you when it mattered. By the time he became Harlem's dominant underworld figure, Bumpy wasn't just feared, he was respected. He mediated disputes, kept violence controlled when possible, and made sure the community benefited enough to tolerate his presence. Store owners, residents, and even some politicians quietly preferred Bumpy's order to the chaos that came without him. Balance between criminal power and neighborhood stability is what made him untouchable for so long. Law enforcement knew exactly who he was, and they chased him relentlessly. Prison became a recurring chapter in his life, but it never broke him. Each time he returned, his influence seemed intact, sometimes even stronger. Behind bars, he studied law and history, preparing himself mentally while others wasted away. Freedom, to Bumpy, was never just about being outside, it was about control. This is why understanding who Bumpy Johnson really was matters before understanding what he did next. He wasn't impulsive, he wasn't reckless. When violence came from him, it came with intent, symbolism, and a message. So when someone touched the only man he ever called brother, the response wasn't emotional chaos, it was calculated, personal, and meant to be remembered. To understand what the word brother meant to Bumpy Johnson, you have to understand how rarely he used it. Bumpy was not a man who handed out trust easily. In a world built on betrayal, informants, and shifting loyalties, he believed most people were temporary. Associates came and went, soldiers were replaceable, and even allies were watched carefully. So, when Bumpy called someone his brother, it wasn't casual language. It was a title earned over time, pressure, and proven loyalty. For Bumpy, brotherhood had little to do with blood and everything to do with consistency. A brother was someone who stood firm when money was tight, when police pressure increased, and when rivals tested boundaries. It meant silence when silence was dangerous, and presence when absence was safer. In Bumpy's eyes, a brother didn't ask questions at the wrong time, didn't hesitate when things turned ugly, and never entertained the idea of switching sides. Level of loyalty was rare, and Bumpy knew it. This idea of brotherhood was shaped early in his life, especially after being separated from his biological family and forced to grow up fast in Harlem. Survival required forming bonds that were stronger than friendship, but more selective than family. Bumpy watched people sell each other out for lighter sentences or better deals, and every betrayal reinforced his belief that loyalty was the most valuable currency on the street. When he found someone who didn't fold, bond became sacred. Calling someone brother also meant protection. Anyone under that title was, in Bumpy's mind, untouchable. Disrespecting them was the same as disrespecting him. Harming them was a direct challenge to his authority and his identity. It wasn't just emotional, it was symbolic. In Harlem, symbols mattered. Reputation mattered. And Bumpy's reputation was built on the idea that lines existed, and crossing them came with consequences. What made this bond even more powerful was how public it was. People knew who Bumpy respected. They watched who stood next to him, who ate at his table, and who moved freely under his name. That visibility acted as a warning. When Bumpy acknowledged someone as a brother, the streets understood that person carried weight beyond their own actions. It was a shield, but also a responsibility. The man Bumpy called brother wasn't just loyal, he was trusted with sensitive matters, personal moments, and situations where failure wasn't an option. This wasn't someone on the outer circle. This was inner, core trust, the kind that kept operations steady and conflicts contained. Losing someone like that wasn't just painful. It destabilized everything around him. That's why what happened next mattered so deeply. When that bond was broken through violence, it wasn't just a murder in Bumpy's world. It was an erasure of something he believed was unbreakable. And for a man who built his entire life on control, respect, and loyalty, kind of loss demanded a response that went far beyond ordinary revenge. Harlem, at the height of Bumpy Johnson's power, was more than a neighborhood. It was a system. Power didn't sit in one place. It moved through clubs, numbers operations, political backrooms, street corners, and police precincts. Everyone knew who mattered, who collected from whom, and which lines could not be crossed. Violence existed, but uncontrolled violence was bad for business, so real power came from keeping order while still inspiring fear. At the top of Harlem's underworld structure were figures who controlled money, rather than muscle. The numbers game was the economic backbone of the streets, pumping cash through barbershops, beauty salons, and small businesses. Whoever controlled the numbers controlled influence, and influence reached far beyond crime. Politicians quietly depended on it, police departments were pressured by it, and community leaders often tolerated it because it kept food on tables. Bumpy Johnson stood at the center of this structure as both enforcer and diplomat. He wasn't the loudest or the flashiest, but he was the most dependable when things needed to be handled decisively. He understood that raw violence brought heat. Selective violence built reputation. Balance allowed him to operate openly in Harlem while still commanding respect behind closed doors. Outside forces were always circling Harlem, especially Italian crime families who wanted control of its cash flow. This created a fragile coexistence, negotiations instead of wars, boundaries instead of chaos. Bumpy played a critical role in maintaining that balance, acting as the bridge between Harlem's black-led operations and the broader organized crime world. If that bridge collapsed, Harlem would burn. Street-level crews answered upward, not randomly. Everyone had a role, and freelancing was dangerous. Unauthorized killings, especially of someone protected, were not just crimes, they were political disruptions. They threatened income streams, alliances, and the illusion of stability that kept law enforcement pressure manageable. It's why certain people were considered off limits. Respect in Harlem wasn't emotional, it was strategic. If a powerful figure allowed disrespect to go unanswered, their authority eroded instantly. Word traveled faster than bullets. One ignored violation could lead to 10 more, each testing whether power was real or just reputation. The streets were always watching reactions, so when the man Bumpy called brother was killed, it wasn't just a personal loss. It was a structural shock. It challenged the unspoken rules that kept Harlem functioning. And in a place where power depended on response, silence was never an option. The murder itself was not random, and that's what made it unforgivable. In Harlem, people understood the difference between street violence and targeted killing. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a heated argument that spiraled out of control. The men involved knew exactly who they were dealing with, and more importantly, who that man was connected to. Taking his life wasn't just an act of violence. It was a deliberate decision to cross a line everyone else respected. What made it worse was the setting and the message behind it. The killing was carried out in a way meant to humiliate and intimidate, sending a signal that protections no longer mattered. Kind of message was dangerous in Harlem's ecosystem. If one protected man could be touched without consequence, then no one was truly safe. The streets immediately felt the shift, and people began watching closely to see how Bumpy would respond. News traveled fast, as it always did. Within hours, whispers moved from barbershops to back rooms, from runners to bookmakers. Some people assumed the killers had powerful backing. Others believed Bumpy's grip had weakened. Both assumptions were risky, because they underestimated how deeply personal this was. This wasn't about territory or money. It was about identity. For Bumpy, the murder represented more than loss. It was betrayal of the unspoken agreement that governed Harlem's balance. Certain men were off limits, because they were innocent, but because touching them invited chaos. By ignoring that rule, the killers weren't just challenging Bumpy. They were challenging the structure that kept everyone alive and paid. What stunned many was how calm Bumpy appeared in the immediate aftermath. There were no public outbursts, no visible retaliation, no frantic movement. That silence unsettled people more than rage would have. Those who knew him understood that stillness meant calculation. Bumpy didn't react emotionally. He responded deliberately. Behind closed doors, questions were being asked and answers were being verified. Who ordered it? Who carried it out? Who provided cover? And who thought this would end quietly? Nothing moved without confirmation. Acting too fast could hit the wrong targets, and that would weaken the message he intended to send. By the time the full truth was clear, one thing was certain across Harlem: this killing had crossed a boundary that could not be ignored. The response, when it came, would not just punish the men responsible. It would restore a rule that everyone had just been reminded still existed. What made this killing different wasn't just who died, but what the act represented. Harlem had seen death before, plenty of it, but most violence followed patterns people understood: disputes over money, territory, or power. This death broke from that pattern. It struck at something personal and symbolic, turning an already tense environment into one filled with uncertainty and fear. The man who was killed wasn't reckless or loud. He wasn't someone who drew attention or provoked enemies. His protection came from his relationship, not from his behavior. That distinction mattered. When someone like that is taken out, it signals that even quiet loyalty is no longer safe. For many in Harlem, that realization was unsettling. There was also the issue of warning, or the lack of it. In the underworld, escalation usually came with signs, threats, confrontations, or pressure. This killing skipped all of that. It was direct and final. That suggested confidence, possibly arrogance, on the part of those responsible. They believed they could act without facing consequences, and that belief itself was dangerous. Timing played a role, too. The murder happened during a period when tensions were already high, alliances were fragile, and outside interests were probing for weakness. Any sign of instability could invite further challenges. This wasn't just bad luck. It was a strategic disruption, intentional or not. The response from the streets reflected that difference. People didn't just mourn, waited. Conversations shifted from sympathy to speculation. Would Bumpy retaliate immediately? Would he negotiate? Would he let it slide? Each possibility carried consequences, and everyone understood that whatever happened next would redefine the rules. For Bumpy himself, this wasn't a moment that allowed compromise. Letting it go would have sent a message that loyalty didn't matter and protection was conditional. Kind of message would unravel everything he'd built. The cost of restraint, in this case, was higher than the cost of retaliation. That's why this killing became a turning point. It forced a response not out of anger, but necessity. The act demanded a correction, one that would make it clear that some lines, once crossed, did not fade quietly into history. The 6 men involved were not outsiders stumbling into trouble. They were known figures on the edges of Harlem's underworld. They weren't top bosses, But they weren't nobodies either. Each one played a role in street operations where confidence often outweighed caution. What tied them together wasn't just the act itself, but the shared belief that this killing would either go unanswered or be blamed on someone else. They came from different corners of the street with different motivations, but a common flaw. Underestimated the meaning of loyalty in Bumpy's world. Some were driven by ambition, hoping to earn reputation through a bold move. Others were motivated by old grudges, debts, or the promise of protection from rival interests. Together, they formed a temporary alliance built on opportunity, not trust. None of them acted alone. That was critical. In Harlem, group violence diluted responsibility, making it harder to assign blame. Each man assumed the others would share the risk, the fallout, and the consequences. That assumption created a false sense of security. Strength in numbers can feel convincing until it isn't. What they didn't fully grasp was how visible they already were. Movements were noticed, conversations were overheard, and alliances were tracked. Harlem wasn't as large as it seemed, and secrets didn't stay buried long. Even before the dust settled, names were circulating quietly, pieced together by informants, rivals, and people who owed favors. Some of the six reportedly believed Bumpy was too entangled with bigger forces to respond directly. Others thought the streets had changed. Fear had softened him, or that time and pressure from law enforcement would force restraint. These weren't reckless thoughts. They were calculated misjudgments based on incomplete understanding. What united all six was the same mistake, treating the killing as a single act rather than a statement. They saw it as a move that ended with death. Bumpy saw it as a challenge that continued until answered. That difference in perspective would decide everything that followed. By the time their involvement became clear, the six men were no longer individuals in Bumpy's eyes. They were part of one action, one violation, and therefore one response. From that moment on, their fate was tied together, whether they realized it or not. Bumpy Johnson's search for the six men was methodical, precise, and ruthless. He didn't rely on hearsay or impulsive action. He relied on information he had meticulously gathered over years on the streets. Every corner, alley, and social circle in Harlem had eyes and ears, and Bumpy knew how to listen. He pieced together movements, behaviors, and conversations until the full picture of who was responsible became undeniable. He began by questioning his closest allies, the ones he trusted most, those who would never lie to him and who had no reason to mislead. Bumpy understood that even small errors could be fatal. Punishing the wrong person would not only damage his reputation, but also destabilize the delicate order he maintained. Patience was his weapon, and every detail mattered. Next, Bumpy observed patterns. Who suddenly disappeared from usual haunts, who avoided familiar routines. In Harlem, absence was as telling as presence. He noticed subtle changes, nervous glances, hesitations in speech, shifts in loyalty. Each small observation added weight to the growing list of suspects. For Bumpy, reading people was as critical as any weapon. He also sent discreet messages through intermediaries, creating opportunities for the six men to reveal themselves. Bumpy didn't rush confrontation. He created situations where their own actions would confirm guilt. This wasn't intimidation for show, it was calculated strategy. Every step allowed him to tighten the circle until the responsible parties had nowhere to hide. While gathering evidence, Bumpy assessed the risk of each potential move. Law enforcement was always watching, and he had to maintain the appearance of normalcy to avoid drawing unwanted attention. His operations ran like clockwork. The city continued. People went about their lives, but behind the scenes, Bumpy's investigation advanced with precision and purpose. By the time he knew exactly who had orchestrated the killing, he had full confidence in his facts. No assumptions, no guesses, no reliance on rumor. Every piece of the puzzle fit together identities, roles, and locations. The plan for retribution could now be executed with the certainty that no innocent bystander would be harmed. What followed was not only a personal response, but also a message to Harlem: loyalty has consequences, betrayal has costs, and the lines of respect and protection in his territory were absolute. The hunt for the 6 men demonstrated that in Bumpy Johnson's world, intelligence, patience, and calculated action were just as deadly as any weapon. The truck incident was as calculated as it was shocking. Bumpy Johnson didn't act out of blind rage. He acted with precision and symbolism. The 6 men were captured and bound together to a single vehicle, a method that sent a clear message. Their actions were inseparable, and so would be their punishment. This was not merely physical retribution. It was psychological, designed to make the streets understand the consequences of crossing him. The act of tying them to one truck carried multiple layers of meaning. On the surface, it demonstrated control. Bumpy had the ability to locate, subdue, and contain all 6 men at once. On a deeper level, it was symbolic of accountability. Their betrayal had linked them together in both crime and consequence. No one could act independently of the others now. Their fate was unified, just as their offense had been. The streets watched in stunned silence as news of the event spread. Everyone understood that Bumpy's actions were deliberate and public enough to be noticed, but discreet enough to avoid unnecessary chaos. He didn't make it a spectacle for cruelty's sake. He made it a lesson for anyone who doubted the rules of loyalty and respect in Harlem. The method of punishment itself became a story, reinforcing his authority without a single word. Each of the 6 men experienced the punishment personally, but also collectively. The physical binding was temporary, but the psychological impact lasted far longer. Being tied together symbolized the inevitability of consequences. Every misstep, every betrayal, every miscalculated move could lead to exposure and accountability. Bumpy ensured that the lesson was clear to them and the community alike. The truck, in this sense, became a moving statement. Wherever it went, it carried the warning of what happens when loyalty is broken. People who saw or heard of the incident immediately grasped the severity of crossing Bumpy Johnson. It wasn't random fear. It was structured deterrence, crafted to maintain order in a world where chaos could quickly take hold. The 6 men had underestimated the personal stakes of their actions. They assumed anonymity, assumed luck, assumed that Bumpy would be forced to negotiate or let time erode his anger. Instead, they faced an immutable force, a response calibrated to fit the crime and resonate beyond the immediate moment. Bumpy's control over the situation left no room for error or evasion. Ultimately, the truck incident reinforced Bumpy Johnson's reputation as someone whose reach was absolute. It wasn't just about punishing betrayal. It was about maintaining the rules, demonstrating power, and ensuring the streets knew that loyalty wasn't optional. The method mattered as much as the message. Bumpy's authority was not to be challenged, and anyone who thought otherwise would quickly learn that in Harlem, actions carried consequences that could not be ignored. The line between myth and documented fact in Harlem's underworld has always been thin, and this story is no exception. Over the years, retellings of Bumpy Johnson's retaliation have grown more sensational, mixing truth with rumor, exaggeration with legend. Separating the verifiable facts from hearsay is essential to understanding what really happened and why it mattered so much. The difference between the two shapes how history remembers both Bumpy and the men who crossed him. Eyewitness accounts provide the backbone of the documented story. People who lived through the events, whether residents, law enforcement officers, or minor players in the street scene, offer insights that are consistent across multiple sources. These accounts confirm the existence of the 6 men, the identity of Bumpy's so-called brother, and the personal nature of the retaliation. They provide a timeline showing that Bumpy acted deliberately after gathering information rather than impulsively. Court documents and police records further corroborate the events. Arrest reports, investigations, and prison records indicate patterns of activity, known associates, and confirmed acts of retribution. While these documents may not capture every nuance or personal motive, they provide a factual framework that separates rumor from reality. They show that Bumpy's reputation for precision was well earned and that his responses followed careful observation and planning. Newspaper reports from the era, though sometimes sensationalized, also serve as a record. While tabloids may have exaggerated the brutality or dramatized the narrative for readers, careful comparison across multiple publications reveals consistent elements. These include the murder of the man he called brother, the involvement of 6 men, and the extraordinary nature of Bumpy's response. Referencing these sources allows historians to reconstruct the event more accurately. Oral histories and biographies add context and color, but must be weighed carefully. Many of Bumpy's associates and descendants contributed stories that blend admiration, fear, and legend. While some details are romanticized or altered in retellings, they offer insight into the community's perception of loyalty, respect, and power. This perception was critical because Bumpy's influence depended as much on belief as on action. Historians also analyze inconsistencies in the stories to uncover truths. Exaggerations, shifts in timelines, or contradictory accounts often highlight what people wanted to believe rather than what actually occurred. By filtering these elements, researchers can identify the consistent threads that are supported by evidence, the deliberate retaliation, the symbolic nature of the truck incident, and the lessons sent to Harlem's streets. Ultimately, the distinction between myth and documented fact underscores the significance of the event. The story of Bumpy Johnson, his brother, and the 6 men is not just about violence, it's about order, loyalty, and reputation. Understanding the factual basis gives insight into the deliberate strategies Bumpy employed, the social structures of Harlem at the time, and why this incident has resonated through history as both legend and reality. The reaction from Harlem streets was immediate and intense. People who lived through the incident understood that it was not just a personal vendetta. It was a message to everyone about boundaries, respect, and the consequences of betrayal. Conversations shifted quickly from everyday life to speculation, analysis, and whispered warnings. Everyone who had a stake in the neighborhood, from shop owners to street level operators, paid attention. Some residents were fearful, while others were fascinated. Fear came from knowing that someone so powerful had decided to act publicly and decisively. Fascination came from witnessing a rare example of order and control in a chaotic environment. The duality of fear and respect created a unique atmosphere, one where loyalty was valued above all else and betrayal carried an unmistakable cost. Rumors spread fast. People debated exactly what had happened, who had been involved, and how Bumpy had managed to locate and punish all 6 men. Some added exaggerations, imagining more dramatic details, while others tried to piece together what was factual. This mix of fact and speculation only heightened Bumpy's mystique, making him both feared and revered. Street-level operators adjusted their behavior immediately. Some became more cautious, carefully weighing every decision. Others reinforced alliances, ensuring that they had support networks in place to avoid similar fates. The streets themselves became a living reminder that actions had consequences and that Bumpy's approval or disapproval was a force to be reckoned with. Even those not directly involved felt the ripple effects. Business dealings were handled more carefully. Disputes were mediated rather than escalated, and the implicit rules of respect were reinforced. Bumpy's retaliation reminded everyone that Harlem's social and criminal ecosystem depended on unspoken agreements, and that violating them invited swift and personal consequences. Law enforcement and outsiders also took notice, though often misinterpreting what had occurred. Some assumed increased violence would follow or that revenge cycles would spiral uncontrollably. Others recognized the calculated precision of Bumpy's response, understanding that this was not chaotic retribution, but a controlled lesson designed to stabilize the streets on his terms. Ultimately, Harlem streets recognized that the incident had changed the rules. The murder and the subsequent punishment of the 6 men were a public declaration. Loyalty was enforceable, betrayal was visible, and consequences were unavoidable. The community, the underworld, and even those on the periphery of both understood that Bumpy Johnson's reach extended farther than many had imagined, that the lines of protection he drew were absolute. Law enforcement's response to the incident was measured but revealing. Police and federal agents quickly recognized that this was not ordinary street violence. The murder of Bumpy Johnson's brother and the subsequent retribution involving 6 men tied to a truck signaled a level of organization, planning, and influence that far exceeded typical criminal activity. Investigators knew they were dealing with someone who understood the system and how to manipulate it to his advantage. Reports and internal communications circulated among precincts, noting the precision of the act and the apparent lack of panic in Harlem streets. Officers acknowledged that Bumpy's influence created a climate where witnesses were reluctant to speak and bystanders were hesitant to get involved. This complicated investigations, as intimidation and loyalty ensured that the community remained largely silent. Law enforcement realized that traditional tactics might not yield results without careful strategy. Some agencies attempted undercover operations to infiltrate Bumpy's networks, but these efforts were met with subtle obstruction. Bumpy's men were loyal, well-informed, and often one step ahead. Agents recognized that even if they could identify individuals, proving complicity in court was another matter. The legal system struggled to catch up with the realities of a neighborhood where reputation and personal codes of conduct often outweighed formal authority. At the same time, the authorities observed the broader message being sent. The act of tying all 6 men to a single truck was public enough to be noticed, but controlled enough to avoid excessive public outcry or mass retaliation. This indicated a level of sophistication that law enforcement found unusual. They realized that Bumpy Johnson wasn't just reacting emotionally. He was demonstrating calculated power, a fact that complicated their approach to policing Harlem. Internal discussions among police suggested a need to understand Bumpy's influence not as a series of isolated incidents, as part of a larger social and criminal framework. Officers studied patterns of loyalty, alliances, territorial control to anticipate potential conflicts. In some ways, law enforcement was learning from him, noting how order and authority could be maintained in a community without complete reliance on legal enforcement. Despite the difficulty in pursuing charges, law enforcement presence increased in strategic locations, attempting to monitor potential retaliation or further disruptions. Surveillance was discreet. Overt action could provoke escalation or drive the community further underground. The authorities were caught between enforcing the law and respecting the realities of Harlem's power dynamics. Ultimately, the response from law enforcement highlighted the unique position Bumpy Johnson held. He operated in a gray zone between public menace and private order, challenging traditional policing methods. While the 6 men's punishment demonstrated personal vengeance, it also underscored the limitations of legal authority in a neighborhood where respect, loyalty, and fear governed more than fear of arrest ever could. Bumpy Johnson's legacy after this event was cemented not just by fear, by respect. People remembered him not only as a powerful figure in Harlem's underworld, as someone who enforced a strict code of loyalty and protection. The way he handled the murder of his brother, calculated, deliberate, and symbolic, became a defining story that shaped how he was perceived both within the streets and beyond. His reputation for fairness within his own terms was as important as his ruthlessness. The incident reinforced the perception that Bumpy was untouchable, not because he was invincible, but because he combined intelligence, strategy, and knowledge of human behavior in ways others could not match. He didn't rely on random violence to inspire fear. He relied on measured responses that carried clear lessons. This approach allowed him to maintain control over Harlem for decades, navigating conflicts, rivalries, and even law enforcement scrutiny with remarkable skill. Bumpy's handling of the 6 men tied to the truck became a cautionary tale. Stories of the incident spread far beyond Harlem, reaching other neighborhoods and even the media. It became a reference point for how betrayal, loyalty, and consequences were enforced in criminal and social hierarchies. People didn't just fear him, they understood that he operated according to his own strict rules, and that respecting those rules ensured survival. His influence extended beyond crime. Bumpy was known to mediate disputes, protect businesses, and maintain a sense of order in the community. Residents often preferred his oversight to the chaos that could arise without it. In this way, his legacy after the incident was paradoxical. Criminal figure whose actions, however violent, reinforced stability and trust within certain bounds of Harlem society. Over time, historians, biographers, and journalists studied Bumpy's life, often returning to this particular event as a pivotal moment. It illustrated the intersection of personal loyalty, power, and symbolism. The story of the murder and the retribution clarified why he was more than a gangster. It showed him as a strategist, a protector, and a man whose code shaped an entire community. Culturally, Bumpy's actions became part of the narrative of Harlem itself. The incident was retold in books, interviews, and oral histories, blending fact and legend in ways that highlighted his intelligence, decisiveness, and uncompromising sense of justice. His legacy endured not only because of the violence he commanded, because of the principles, however personal and idiosyncratic, he enforced. Ultimately, the event confirmed that Bumpy Johnson's name would be remembered long after his death. He became a symbol of power, loyalty, and consequences, and the way he handled betrayal defined the essence of his leadership. Harlem's streets learned that crossing him, or the people he considered family, was never just a misstep. It was a violation with lasting consequences, solidifying Bumpy's enduring place in history.